Well, good evening, everyone. We are excited that you have decided to join us on this Wednesday night. We know there are a number of other things happening in Frederick County specifically tonight. There's a Board of Education meeting going on right now discussing mask mandates in the schools, and so we know that there are a lot of other things that that are among us. But we thank you for joining Arch tonight, and our guest speaker, Miss Michelle Wright. Um, my name is Cavante Duckett. I have the pleasure of serving on the board of directors for the Arts Society, and have recently been appointed the chair of our nominating committee. So I'm excited to be here and to facilitate tonight. I was grateful when Miss Rose made the call, and so whenever she calls, I have to say yes. And so thank you, Miss Rose, for all you do for Arch and for our community. I mentioned it early on, but we have muted everyone. We do ask that you use the chat box to post your questions. I will read those questions to Michelle and try to stay on top of those the best I can. Should I miss one of your questions, please feel free to either message me directly or repost it in the chat. For those that, just a reminder, at the bottom of the screen, just hit the chat button and then you will be able to type everything, and we will read your questions to Michelle. Feel free to type them while she is speaking, or you can wait until she is complete and then put your messages in the chat box. I feel like I have talked enough already, and so we are going to go ahead and introduce Miss Michelle Diane Wright. Michelle was born and grew up in Frederick, Maryland. She graduated from Governor Thomas Johnson High School. She has a Bachelor's of Arts in English and art history, a minor in African and African American Studies from Dartmouth College. She has a Master's of Arts in History, concentrated in African American history, and a Master's of Arts in Black Studies from Ohio State University. She is currently an Associate Professor and Coordinator of History and Africana Studies programs at Community College of Baltimore, of the Community College of Baltimore County. I'm sorry. Michelle recently completed historical research and a historical narrative on African Americans in Frederick County for the Arts Society. And so without further ado, what we all have come here for tonight is to hear from Miss Michelle. So welcome, Michelle. Thank you for joining us on this evening, and the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you, Cavante. I appreciate the generous introduction. I appreciate it. I want to thank all of you for coming out this evening. I see a lot of familiar names. I just want to say hi to Dean and to Sarah. I see Liz Shadow here. Hello, everyone. Some of you may have attended the talk that I did for FCC actually 2 weeks to the day ago. There is a little tiny bit of overlap, but this is all new material. So I just want to say how I came to choose this topic. And as everyone knows, when Rose asks you to do something, you do it. So we were just talking about that before. So when she said, just pick any topic that came from the research you did about the history of Black Frederick. And what I decided to do is something that I think is important, what I like to do in my classroom with my students is to link history with what's going on in the present and see the connections, see the fact that what's going on today is not new. We haven't reinvented the wheel. The Black Lives Matter movement is a continuation of an ongoing movement that's been happening here for a very long time. We name it different things at different points in history. However, it's all about some very similar subject matter. I'm not going to try and keep you too long. I would really like to kind of move through the presentation and then open it up to questions and discussion if we can, and make this a little bit more of a dialogue, rather than just, me speaking at you for the entirety of the time. So what I'm going to do right now is share my screen and make sure that I have the proper Prezi up. It's funny, when I teach remotely, we don't use Zoom, we use Microsoft Teams. So I am not as adept at Zoom as I would like to be. All right. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure I move this out of the way. So I think in the eyes of many people, when they hear the three words Black Lives Matter, they sort of think about one particular thing. They think about the movement as it has existed, in the past 10 years or so. But if you really take a look at history, you see that this is a reiteration of movements that have occurred over history, and specifically in Frederick. I'm going to talk about Frederick. I'm going to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement in a larger sense, but then sort of focus in on the ways in which Frederick has dealt with some of the issues of injustice and racism within its confines. So I really want to kind of start big and then move a little bit more narrowly, and then talk about connections to today, connections to 2022 and beyond in the future. So, one of the things that I always ask my students on the first day of class, what is your definition of history? I always like for them to give me their definition, because you'd be surprised at how many different definitions that you might get from the students. But one of the first things that they say is that we need to learn from the past in order to improve our future. And so with that in mind, there are connections that we can make in order to do that. So the first thing that I'm going to look at, and let's see, this isn't going to work here. So let me see if I can do it that way. Okay, so what is the Black Lives Matter movement? I think in some people's minds, it is a very narrowly defined movement, but ultimately, this is now, at this point, almost 10 years later, it's an international social movement. Now, it started in 2013, and it at first was a hashtag and focused on issues of police brutality, profiling, etc., in the lives of African Americans. It's important to note that voices from the Black community have been talking about police brutality long before 2013. It's not new. I think the thing that has made the Black Lives Matter such a big force, such an international force, is cell phones, is social media, cameras right on our phones, right in our pockets. So now we can record it. But Black people have been saying for decades, if not centuries, that we have been mistreated, that there has been police brutality, and our lives have not mattered. And ultimately, what the Black Lives Matter movement is about is opposing systematic racism. And systematic racism, most simply defined, is racism that's really embedded in the laws and the regulations and the culture of society. And it's not just, a lot of people think racism is sort of that one-on-one encounter that individual people have. It's something, but this is something that is more so baked into the system, into the infrastructure of our society. So what Black Lives Matter, if you really take the time to read about what they're talking about, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, and really focus on what the movement has been about and what it continues to be about, because it's still in existence, it's still there, it's now international. I have pictures on the side of Black Lives Matter protests in Paris, in London, and then of course in Frederick. So you see the global the global implications here. So movements to end systematic racism and unwarranted violence has been around for a long time. And for those of you who are historians out there, specifically historians focused on African American history, you're probably very, very familiar with John Blasingame There Is a River. And one of the major assertions that he makes in this book is about 40 years old, but it's an important book, is that the movements to end justice and inequality are all continuations. They are not new movements every 10 years, every 50 years, or however. It is essentially the same movement, sort of reinvented, reinvigorated in a way that addresses the issues that are pertinent in that particular moment in time. So the way I am really looking at Black Lives Matter is the push to end systematic racism, the push to fight injustices that are rooted in racial prejudice. I mean, most obviously, this has been going on for decades. This is not something that just started in 2013. So it's important to look at this movement that we're currently in the middle of as a continuation of something that's been going on. That each generation, or the young people that come along, and I tell my students this all the time, it's up to you. I'm old, and I've done my protesting and all of my kind of stuff. And I mean, not that I don't still do that, but it's up to the next generation to really take the torch and kind of move forward and take what you've learned from previous generations and move in a progressive way. So one thing I want to talk about is that all of these anti-racist movements, or movements against systematic racism, have always been met with backlash. They have always been met with doubts from the wider public that have said, it's too fast, it's too soon, you're asking for too much, or have just completely denied the fact that the voices of African Americans and their allies, and it's important to talk about the allies, and I'll talk more about that, because it's not just African Americans. There are plenty of allies out there that are doing the work and are out there having their voices heard, that are equally as important as African Americans. But there has been a modicum of backlash. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the resistance to these anti-racist movements. And I have to say, one of my favorite sort of defenses or explanations about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter is coming from social media. And if you read what Adam Campbell, and this came out several years ago, but I think it really, really describes what it's saying, because I hear a lot of people that respond with Black Lives Matter and say, all lives matter. And this is a detraction away from what the central issue is. The central issue is, as he says, yes, all lives matter. No one is going to disagree with that statement. No one is going to say that that's not true. However, repeatedly, cyclically, ongoing, there have been systematic situations. There have been situations where Black lives have not been respected, have not been seen as human. The humanity has been stripped away from African Americans in many cases here, and a lot of that has to do with structural or systematic racism. So the fact that the devaluation of African American lives has been an ongoing problem, and it took something like cell phones, it took something like the videos and the pictures and everything that people take on their phones to actually prove this, although African Americans have been saying this for forever, it's not surprising to me, but it's kind of a sad situation when, if someone says for decades, we're facing these types of obstacles, we're facing these types of oppression and exploitation, and no one takes it seriously. and it's only with video footage that then it becomes somewhat respected and somewhat taken into account. I'll just give you one historical example of this. October 1966 in Oakland, California, a 16-year-old young African-American man was shot and killed by the police. And his name was Denzel Dowell. And Denzel Dowell in Oakland, California, led Huey Newton and Bobby Seale to form the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And the whole reason that the Black Panthers were formed in the first place in October 1966 is because they said there is police brutality, Blacks are getting killed by the police. And this is 50 some odd years ago, almost 60 years ago, that this situation occurred. And here you have a whole organization that people are familiar with, whereby they're saying the reason why we're carrying guns is we're going to patrol the Black community because the police are not doing it for us. We are going to do it for ourselves, and we're going to protect the Black community from the police. So as long ago as that was a Black Lives Matter movement, saying that if Blacks are being killed in the street by the police, that's unacceptable. We're not going to allow this to happen anymore. We're going to take matters into our own hands. So again, this is sort of showing that the Black Lives Matter movement is piggybacking off of movements that have come before. I kind of want to go back and those of you who were in the FCC lecture that I did on the nadir of African Americans in Frederick, briefly, the word nadir means the lowest possible point for a group of people. And the time period from 1877, and historians disagree on the end date, but I usually go with 1920, in the close of World War I and after Red Summer of 1919. So from 1877 to 1919 or 1920 was a period that is considered to be worse than enslavement. And so this time period is when a lot of the, there was just sort of a lashback against African Americans during that time. It included, and obviously Jim Crow segregation came before, but it was solidified and codified during this time period, specifically with Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, but even before that with Black codes, and then forward all the way up until the 60s and the 70s. You had disenfranchisement that occurred. And again, I always remind everyone, when your vote is taken away, when you're disenfranchised, you not only lose the vote, you lose your ability to serve on a jury and your ability to run for political office. So not only was the vote taken away from Black men in 1877, their ability to represent themselves and they have their voice be heard was taken away, and their ability to be in a jury of their peers is taken away as well. Lynching, racial terror lynching, and I'm going to talk more about racial terror lynching, has a tremendous uptick at this point. This is when Tuskegee starts keeping a record in 1880 all the way up until the 1960s of racial terror lynching. Well, they do all lynching, but specifically they're focusing on racial terror lynching, which is mob killing without due process. The convict lease system, which took advantage of the 13th Amendment loophole of if you are convicted of a crime, you can be enslaved. Convict lease system is called slavery by another name, and this system lasted into the 20th century as well. So all of this time, and again, this is sort of what I talked about in the talk about the nadir in Frederick. Fredericktonians, Black Fredericktonians, but there have been some allies, have pushed back against these injustices, and many, many more that I haven't mentioned, and asserted the idea that Black lives do matter, that you cannot go around lynching people, those people's lives matter, or locking them up for loitering or other petty crimes, their lives matter. So this is really what I'm looking at to see this ongoing movement in Frederick and how it manifested itself there. So we're going to go to Frederick during the Nader, and you can see I have a picture here of a cross burning, and this is actually a picture that was taken in Frederick, in Emmitsburg, I believe, but it was taken in 1994. So just sort of to kind of give you the idea of, the Klan activity that a lot of people are familiar with that happens in Frederick. This is a 1994 picture, but I think it sort of symbolizes what a lot of times what we think about Frederick during the nadir of African American history. So I want to talk about lynching, because really the anti-lynching campaigns, whether it be the Tuskegee Institute or Ida B. Wells, or later on in the early part of the 20th century with the creation of the NAACP and forward, the anti-lynching campaigns at their root were Black Lives Matter movements. And so again, lynching is defined as a mob killing without due process. And I'm heavily relying, let me give a shout out to Dean Herron. I'm heavily relying on his wonderful, wonderful paper, The Mob Fairly Howled, Lynching in Frederick County, Maryland, 1879 to 1895, with this information that I'm sharing with you. And I went into a lot more detail about lynching in my talk, in a previous talk, but it's important to sort of understand the history of racial terror lynching as it occurred. And there were three that had have historic significance, or there were three in Frederick County in specifically. The whole state of Maryland had 34. If you look at some of the Tuskegee numbers, the listing of lynchings in other states, I'm sure you would see a lot of things that don't get this up, that wouldn't surprise you. Mississippi has, I think, 600. Places like Alabama, Louisiana, the deep South states are the states that have the highest numbers. But there are other states that have some fairly significant numbers as well. And also to mention, not just African Americans were lynched. People of all races and ethnicities have been lynched. Whites, a lot of Latinx, Asian, et cetera, men and women have been lynched. But what we're talking about are racial terror lynchings. So the three that occurred in Frederick County were in 1879, 1887, and in 1895. So really at the meaty part of that nadir, this is when the race relations were at their worst by any stretch of the imagination. Not to say that they dramatically improved shortly after that, but this is where the racial terror lynchings occurred in Frederick County. So you have James Carroll, who was lynched in Licksville at Point of Rocks, a week after he was accused of entering the home of Regina Thomas and in Licksville. And so that is the earliest of the recorded lynchings. There's a lot of really interesting accounts of that. I have this, and I'll share this link. How do I get rid of this? I don't know how to get rid of this. Do we know how to get rid of this? Okay, I'll just do that. That talks about these lynchings. The newspaper accounts are quite compelling, just to sort of read through sort of a lot of what is going on, the reactions, et cetera. So I just kind of wanted to show that, just some of those newspapers, and there's so many more. And again, if you really want to get the detail, I would get the piece written by Dean Herron, because I'm relying on it for my research for the narrative as well as for this. Later, I'm just going to talk about each one, and then I'm going to talk about the follow-up and some of the things that occurred, not only in Frederick, about the Frederick lynchings, but in other places as well. So on November 18th, 1877, this is on Jefferson Street in Frederick in the city. A white mob, and again, mob killing without due process, killed John Biggis. He was hanged from a tree that we're going to talk about in just a minute about that particular locust tree that was there. I'm going to read a little bit from Dean's piece about that. And then a few years later, on November 17th, 1895, James Bowen, accused of raping Lily Long, was hanged from the exact same locust tree that John Biggis was hanged from. So I want to read some of the responses because I feel like reading this and some of the newspaper articles, in addition to Dean's article, that of course, the jury found no one responsible. So there was no one that was punished for any of these three lynchings, as I guess many of us could probably expect as a result. But there was a pushback, and what's interesting is sort of the rumor mill, or the way that many of the whites in Frederick sort of were afraid that there was going to be a very violent black backlash. And so you have this thing, no one was found guilty. There were white Fredericktonians, Louis Engelbrecht, who said, we hope the rascal who did do this, because he asserted that this was a white Frederick resident, should be caught and probably dealt with. This case deserves proper attention. So again, the importance of the allies who are supporting everything that's going on. You have Engelbrecht saying this is not right. I'm losing. Okay, when we think of the offenses of the law, we should look into this matter further. Another white resident of Frederick, former provost marshal of Frederick during the Civil War, said he thought it was a case of mistaken identity and was critical of everything that happened, and said that this was an out and out murder. This shouldn't have happened. And then, but later on, of course, African Americans believed that with these cases, the people were killed, were murdered without warrant, and that it was in fact a murder, and that they were angry about the lynching. But there were in the Frederick News claims, this was in 1887, that members of the colored population in Frederick have been very fierce today in their threats against white people. And there were a couple of accounts that African Americans, of course, understandably, were feeling some kind of way, feeling a little salty about the situation, I guess you could say. And the Frederick News goes on to say there's a perceptible state of lawlessness. There was a perceptible state of lawlessness that night, and the indignant colored people seemed to be organizing a move of some kind. And early in the evening, it was ascertained that they intended to drag ex-policeman Marshall F. Harding from his home and lynch him. The newspaper also reported that small groups of colored men, apparently well armed, some of them carrying whips, were spotted on the streets of Frederick. The United Fire Company was also allegedly a target of angry African Americans for having let the lynchers use axes and other implements to break the jail. So this fear of retaliation is a thread that's running through the aftermath of this. The rumor of an attack by the Negroes upon the jail was simply the alarmed thought of some featherbrain who sees a conspiracy in every private consultation and an army with banners in every social group. So while Black citizens of Frederick were obviously discussing this, there were meetings that were taking place about what should be done. It was perceived as something that was going to be a violent attack upon them. So you have this going in. Let me make sure I'm getting the right date. So there the African Americans in Frederick felt it necessary to make a statement, and they made a statement, and this is from the Frederick Republic Citizen, December 2nd, 1887, and they're trying to distance themselves by these assertions that they are going to be violent and they're going to be pushing against and having these, some other kind of uprising that was going to occur. And they say, resolve that we emphatically contradict the statements that have been circulated that the colored people of this city have made threats against ex-policeman Marshall F. Harding or Sheriff Durr, or against those persons reported to have been connected with the recent lynching. True, a few drunken colored men might have been heard to make threats, but such expressions do not meet our approbation. The law has cleared Mr. Harding and can be expected to investigate the lynching and deal out justice to the offenders, and we are satisfied. So I think we have to understand the context in which that statement was made. I mean, I think with 2022 eyes, it's like, well, why are y'all, kind of backing down from this? At its core, it has to be fear. Retaliation lynchings against racial terror lynchings were something that were very common. If people spoke out too loudly, too forcefully, then they would be targeted. This is what happened to Ida B. Wells. She's in Memphis, Tennessee, and she is protesting the lynching of her 3 friends in Memphis. And she has a newspaper and writes about this. And then she is, because she's writing about the horrific nature of what happened, she is then threatened with lynching. She has to leave Memphis, never to return, and moves to Chicago and spends the rest of her life there. So understanding that many of these African Americans are also in fear of their lives, that they know that they're being watched. They are the numerical minority in location. You have to be really careful and make sure that they're not pushing too hard. Not to say they did not push at all, but they had to be really careful about how that was going to be done. However, there was an organization. Let me make sure I am getting this. This is a Baltimore organization called the United Mutual Brotherhood of Liberty in Baltimore. And they had been watching lynchings throughout the state of Maryland and were responding to make sure that they would be addressed throughout. Making the statement from Baltimore has a modicum of safety that the Frederick-black residents don't have. And I'm just going to read a little bit of their statement. We believe that all classes of law breakers among our people should pay the full penalty of the law. Yet we cannot help feeling that if white men are permitted to be tried in the court for crimes against women, colored men should be allowed to have a hearing and the right of bail, especially where a doubt is expressed of their guilt. So he's saying there needs to be an equal appreciation of blacks and whites under the course of law, that there needs not be one law for white citizens and one law for black citizens. So they put forth a resolution denouncing the lynching as a crime against the state, society, the colored race, and humanity, and censuring the sheriff and other public officers as guilty of gross criminal neglect. And they offered a reward of $500 for the arrest and conviction of anyone implicated in the lynching. So there was pushback. I want to talk a little bit about the pushback after the 1895 lynching of James Bowens. There was a lot. The white community were some in the white community, I'll say some in the white community were outraged and voiced their and said that there are some who were openly and bitterly that they condemned the actions of the lynchings. So there were allies. There were people who were talking about that. So it became a thing where there were white citizens in the city of Frederick who were assisting in that. Also in Frederick, I'll read this, the ministers of the colored churches denounced the lynching last night, but the members of the race here declare that while they do not uphold the mob, they think Bowen's deed deserved severe punishment. So they're trying to find a place in the middle that's going to keep them safe. So again, there were additional rumors about a backlash in the Black community. The Maryland National Guard, the Frederick Riflemen were called out to hold them down. But it's important to note that African Americans were not completely voiceless. They did voice their outrage against this. What is interesting, and it's pointed out in this essay, is that there is sort of a vacuum with regards to African American press at this point of time. And so a lot of what the reporting is based on more mainstream, even though they have various perspectives, but mainstream newspapers. But I think ultimately the fact that the locust tree that both Biggis and Bowens were hanged from was eventually removed, was cut down. On Saturday, November 23rd, a week after Bowens' murder, the locust tree on the Butler farm used for the hanging was cut down. The newspaper notice about this did not say who cut the tree down or why it was cut down, but it did add that the tree used in the lynching of John Biggis in 1887, which stood about 100 yards from it stood 100 yards from where Bowens was lynched, was no longer standing either. So, this is sort of this surreptitious type of a protest, a pushback against that, asserting again, and maybe in a more symbolic way, but asserting that their Black lives did matter and that we do not want to continue this again. There was no recorded lynching following that time period after that. I want to talk a little bit about the franchise, about the suffrage and the fight for the franchise. And
Hey,
if you look
Michelle,
at, which I will, yeah.
we have one question in the chat before we move on. And it is, were there specific consequences of lynching terrors in Frederick? I know you touched on this a little bit, but if you
How do I get rid of this? Well, and honestly, the person that is the expert on this is Dean. But from what I understand, there were court cases and the juries found no one responsible. If you look back at most lynchings, and there's a really good book that has the same title, At the Hands of Persons Unknown, is usually what is listed on the death certificate of a lot of the racial terror lynchings, because we know it's a group of people, we know it's a mob, but no one's going to be named specifically. Now, you have circumstances where people were held accountable, they were taken to trial. However, they weren't found guilty. There was no meeting out of this in that way, form, or fashion. As far as I can tell, and anyone can jump in if they know anything more specific about that. As far as I can tell, as the case with most of the racial terror lynchings, no one was ultimately held accountable or punished for any of those three lynchings. But the Black community was outraged and did push back and asserted that this is something that that cannot continue. So in other places, and we'll see where our proximity to places like Baltimore and Washington, D.C. kind of play into some of the actions of the white authority structure in Frederick. So we'll kind of talk about that. I'm hoping I answered the question as well as I am capable of answering the question. I am hopeful.
thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to talk a little bit about the vote. Black men were granted the vote with the 15th Amendment in 1870. And for 7 years, nationally, Black men enjoyed that franchise, enjoyed elections as high up as Congress. There were Black men from Mississippi, from South Carolina, other states that had primarily had Black majorities. But it was short-lived. The Reconstruction abruptly ended in 1877. That's why this sort of cutoff date in 1877. So in many cases, Black men were disenfranchised. Black women or women of any color do not have the federal right to vote until 1920. So this is a concern 50 years later for Black women. But in 1877, all types of tactics were utilized to keep Black men from their right to vote, whether it be poll taxes, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, a number of methods that that came into play. And in 1910, you have a situation where the Digges Amendment, which is a Maryland constitutional amendment, grants the right specifically for all white male citizens over 21. They gave them the right to the vote. But again, this is just in the state of Maryland, which then covers Frederick County and Frederick City. It kept Black men away from the polls with the tactics that I just said. There was a specific Frederick law that stated that only those men who own more than $500 worth of property were permitted to vote, or if they could prove they were male descendants of registered voters before 1869, which, 15th Amendment doesn't pass until 1870. So you have this Frederick law that's instituted as well, in addition to the one that the state of Maryland has put into the Constitution also. So there were various and sundry ways that they were keeping Black men away from the ballot box, but also out of any jury. So when you go back and you look at the juries for the lynching, you see that there's not going to be any Black men on those juries. So that significantly alters any kind of a fair outcome. But then also not capable of running for political office. So in 1912, Luther Potts, and there were several others along with him, created an organization called the Manhood Suffrage League of Frederick. And at the core of the Black Lives Matter movement is a fight for agency, is a fight to say that the Black vote should not be taken away. If you sort of focus on what the Black Lives Matter movement is doing today, one of the things is fighting against some of the efforts that are happening in certain states, Georgia and other places, to disenfranchise a lot of people. So this Manhood Suffrage League of Frederick is created specifically to end disenfranchisement in Frederick for Black men, based on the grandfather clause, specifically, and based on the property laws. Well, what happens is there were 30 African-American men who were a part of the Manhood Suffrage League of Frederick, Dr. Bourne, John Bruner, some of the names that you may be familiar with in Frederick history during this time period, whereas they said no. And there was an assertive movement to ensure that they did away with these types of laws. And they were successful. A year later, and then we had 30 African-American who were registered to vote and voted in the June 1913 Frederick election. So this pushback to say that our voice matters, what we have to say is important, what we have to contribute, and the fact that we want to serve on juries and even run for political office is something that we want to do. Another interesting thing that happened was that also during this time period, Dr. Bourne is moving to create an independent Black political party in Frederick. There was, and this is the newspaper article about that, the National Liberty Party was a Black political party, and Baltimore had already formed this Black political party, and Dr. Bourne was trying to get one in the city of Frederick. And so was actually when he went to Baltimore to speak with some people and create this meeting and at the Nazarite Hall, which eventually becomes Pythian Castle. If you're familiar with that, right next to Asbury, you have a situation where they're chased out of this. It has to suddenly be stopped because there is a fear that that there is going to be violence. So he's trying to bring these ideas back from Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and put them in Frederick, with this new independent Black political party, so that African Americans had options and not only becoming part of the Republican Party, but have their own political party. And he was met with the threat of violence, and so this had to sort of be kind of swept to the side as something that they couldn't do. So this fight for the franchise, this fight for the vote, is something that was, again, asserting that the voices of African Americans mattered, that their lives mattered, that they wanted to participate as citizens, as tax-paying citizens in the system as it stood at that time. Okay, I'm going to move on. I'm trying to move through a little bit quickly so we can have more questions and more conversation. I want to talk about the civil rights and Black Power eras. At this time period. And I don't know if you can see, it's too small. If I try to go in, it's not going to let me. But it was about the plans of the citizens of Frederick who were going to the 1963 March on Washington. One of my grandfather attended that march. There were buses that came from Frederick into DC to participate in that. And this is what this Frederick Post article is about, that that there were threats to the railroad and other things, and that, is this going to be a problem for the march? Ultimately, it was not. But it also talks about the group from Frederick who attended. But I want to talk about the goals, and I looked at and found the goals of the Frederick NAACP chapter. And NAACP the chapter in Frederick was started much later. Originally, the NAACP was created in 1908, 1909. By a group of both whites and Blacks working together. But I wanted to kind of look side by side at sort of the mission statements or the goals or the objectives of both of these groups, and you see some overlapping sentiments being expressed here. And really, I mean, if you look at the Frederick NAACP objectives, ensure political, educational, social, economic equality of all citizens, remove barriers to racial discrimination through the democratic process, all of these things that the NAACP, which is still active in Frederick, are seeking to achieve. And so the NAACP has a long history in Frederick of pushing back and, again, saying Black Lives Matter. And you kind of look at some of the mission and the mission statement for Black Lives Matter changes on a yearly basis, and they address maybe new things that are coming up, but they're talking about the humanity and the contributions of Black people, no matter their gender or what have you, et cetera, et cetera. The gender statement was the statement that was added this year. And again, the Black Lives Matter mission statement changes. It's sort of a work in progress type of a thing. But they're saying that, Black Lives Matter is the rallying cry for all Black lives striving for liberation. And so both the NAACP, which we think of, at least today we think of, maybe not back in the day, but we think of today as a more conservative leaning organization than we would the Black Lives Matter movement. Both of these movements are looking to achieve some of the same exact things. They have similar missions, similar objectives, and both use different forms of protest rallies in order to assert those needs. This is a 1967 NAACP ongoing protest, and these are two different articles I can kind of show that they want, that they are addressing housing in Frederick. This is after the passage of the Voting Rights and the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65. And many people think, oh, we've achieved our goals, but there's still some lingering issues that they're dealing with. So they are pushing for really, if you go and look and you do the research, the end of redlining in the city of Frederick, the end of the systematic racism that has been occurring, that is forcing African Americans only into certain neighborhoods and not allowing African Americans into other neighborhoods. So they're pushing against that. They're talking about public housing. They're talking about a lot of different things if you read through all of the various and sundry articles. But the point that I'm making is that there are overlaps. There are similar demands that are being made by the NAACP of 1967 that are being made in the Black Lives Matter movement of 2022 and even before that. I want to say a little bit about the aftermath of the King assassination. Martin Luther King was murdered in 1968. And what happened following that is there were uprisings in cities all over the country. And there were some very serious uprisings, and I'm in Baltimore now, but here in the city of Baltimore, as well as Washington, D.C. So because of the proximity to Frederick and, sort of the close relationship that Frederick had with those two cities and still has, there was a huge fear that an uprising was going to occur in the city of Frederick. They felt like there would be the same type of situation that would occur. Well, it never happened. There were no, as Frederick braced for the worst, and cities like Baltimore and DC are putting out their militia and other groups. I'm drawing a blank, but other groups to police the cities. There are curfews. All these other things are being instituted in these two cities. Frederick, the Black Frederick, decides to make this statement, and this is a statement that came just a couple of days after King's death, and that's when most of the uprisings were occurring, the day of and several days within a week after that. And so you have them saying that we're going to be peaceful about this in respect of Dr. King, and you have all of these different Black businesses, Black churches, Black individual leaders like Dr. Bourne and other people who are lending their name. This was a full-size ad in the Frederick News Post that they took out, that ran. I can look real quick. I think it is April 9th, 1968 that this ad ran. And it's saying, yes, Martin Luther King's life mattered. He was important to us. What he stood for was important to us. And we're making this statement. We are making it known that we do not just blindly accept this. We are definitely letting it known that something has to happen. So there were no violent uprisings or anything that occurred in Frederick. However, a group was created called the Interracial Dialogue Group. And this was in 1968 into 1969 that this was created. And it was there to have citizens of all races and ethnicities in the city of Frederick, and I guess in the county as well, is communication. And that if there was an understanding on both sides, if there's an understanding with regards to how there are still racial concerns, even though we have achieved this legislation was passed and it seems to be improving, there are still some problems that we need to address. Again, our lives matter. And we want to talk about this with other individuals in the city of Frederick. I've heard Mr. Gordon talk about this. I think he was a part of this organization, and some other leaders in Frederick. I believe George Dredden and Billy and other people were a part of this group of African Americans that were meeting with other whites to kind of talk about these issues that still existed in the city of Frederick. So again, not just sitting by, but pushing back. We have to keep in mind that during the civil rights movement and the Black Power movements, and they overlap. So I always kind of talk about them in conjunction. Different objectives, different tactics, but sort of overlapping time frames. So this is in the midst of both of them. Many people pushed back. There was a pushback saying, you're asking for too much too soon. You need to go slow. And accusing. I mean, this is one of the reasons why King was assassinated, is that you're pushing too hard. You're trying to make changes too quickly. You are, being overly sensitive. All of the same type of things that are said to members of the Black Lives Matter movement. That this is too much. It's the wrong tactic. It's the wrong way to do this. We're not in the place. So I just wanted to kind of juxtapose these two moments in time to see that even though there may be different methods, the assertion is still that Black lives do matter. So I wanted to look at I find this interesting. This is one of those things, and my students kind of put up with me on this. I just find it interesting that Baker Park, and I don't even have all of the articles or pictures here that I wanted to share, but Baker Park has always been the center of protest in Frederick. And it goes back even before 1964, but I just wanted to kind of share some of the articles that I found over the course of time that are using Baker Park as their jumping off point. And the reason why I find it so interesting, because of understanding who Joseph Dale Baker was. Joseph Dale Baker was an admitted segregationist. And when Baker Park comes into fruition in the 1920s, when it's built, it's a segregated park. I'm sure some of you have heard the stories from Claude DeLauder and other people about their experiences trying to just walk through Baker Park at some point and being accosted and just the difficulty. But the fact that Baker Park has always been the place where Frederick has met to protest what they perceive to be injustices, and there's a lot of them here. This was an NAACP 1964 voters drive, and I'm gonna see if you can see here. I mean, there's some names I know, Edith Addison, other people that were singers. This was a voter registration drive. 1964 was the year that the I'm sorry, 1965 was the year that the Voting Rights Act came into play. So 1964 was the year that you had a lot of activity going on. Before that, you had the Mississippi Freedom Summer and other sort of voting right drives that went on throughout the country to ensure that African Americans got the vote. But there were other movements that placed the Baker Park at the center. Anti-Vietnam war efforts. This is a 1969 thing that is talking about anti-war rally that went on. 400 people in Baker Park in 1969 protesting the Vietnam War. I think a lot of them, from reading some of the other articles, a lot of them were Hood College students, but there were other people that joined in as well. This is 1916. This was a what was it called? Love Trumps Hate rally that occurred in 2016 that were for the most part, primarily from what I've seen in the pictures and from what I read, white Frederick residents who were kind of outraged by Trump being elected and wanted to speak out against that, to let people know that they weren't there. Then you have this is another one again. Endpoint, Baker Park, Manshall, Frederick, Maryland. This is a Black Lives Matter march that was going on in 2020, and then the more recent 2021. This was a rally after the January 16th. I'm sorry, January 6th uprising that occurred down at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. So different things are happening throughout the years, and Baker Park, which was founded as a segregated park where Black people could not even, go to. And so obviously the injustice is right there at the very inception of the park, and that now, this park is being used as a place to vocalize and make assertions against these injustices. I think it's kind of interesting. And there were so many more that I found, but I didn't want to overcrowd the page with too much. So I want to talk about today, and then I'm going to shut up and listen to what you have to say about the movement continuing today in various and sundry forms. You might recognize the sheriff of Frederick here. So some of the more recent rallies or assertions of Black Lives Matter, within the last couple of years, within the last 10 years specifically, have come into play. If you're not familiar with the Akan idea of Sankofa means reach back and fetch it, meaning learn your history in order to empower yourself and make for a better future. So it's important to understand the connections between the protests of the past and what's going on today, because I think they're intricately they're intertwined. They're a part of that. This was the Roger Brooke Taney statue that stood in front of the Frederick courthouse since 1930, I can't remember, 31 maybe. And this was a protest throwing the red paint over top of him. But the statue, because of pushback, because people said, Taney represents racism, he represents structural systemic racism, we don't want this statue representing Frederick. People pushed back and successfully had the statue removed in 2017. More recently, Frederick County Sheriff Chuck Jenkins when I was reading about this, I didn't know there were this many lawsuits. I knew there was, people didn't care for him, or some people didn't care for him, but I didn't realize there were so many lawsuits against this man, trying to get him out of office, that they're based on, profiling people of color, gender discrimination, all kinds of racism and civil rights violations that have occurred. I just want to show this brief news account of the march that occurred to remove Chuck Jenkins, to force the resignation of Chuck Jenkins. Let me see if I can get here. Can you guys see my screen still? Can you see where's the video?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so you can see that I'm trying to get to the.
Yes.
This is my region shopping. Yes. Bought some Crocs. Okay, I'm trying to get this video. Oh my God, my internet connection is unstable. I'm trying to get to this video is what I'm really trying to do. So I'm going to start it over, turn the sound on, and let you.
Those deadly riots in the nation's capital last week, protesters took to the streets in downtown Frederick to speak out about the events and local officials.
As our WDVM's Timothy Young has the story.
It's a revolution! It's a revolution! It's a revolution! It's a revolution!
Demonstrators gathered at the Baker Park Bandshell in downtown Frederick, protesting what happened at the Capitol building on January 6th and how they felt the Frederick County Conservative Club and some officials were complicit in it happening.
Shout and the flag go hand in hand! Shout and the flag go hand in hand!
The protesters referenced a video of Frederick County Sheriff Chuck Jenkins speaking to the Conservative Club in December.
My apologies.
They said Jenkins' statements were false, harmful, and he should resign from his position.
And when I think about the election, the way it was stolen, I am not enforcing any of these silly government rules. Find out this was the biggest fraud ever perpetrated.
He continued to say that the election was stolen, that they were under siege, and that this was good versus evil. And then 3 weeks later, you had that same club send over 150 people in 3 different buses down to the Capitol.
Fred Profiter of the Conservative Club said no one in his group had anything to do with the Capitol violence, and they were there to express their First Amendment rights.
It's one of our most basic rights. Yeah, we have a right to redress our grievances with our governments, whether it's federal, state, or local.
But yeah, you have the freedom of speech, sure, of course you do. But when you're spreading lies that incite violence, it's no longer your right.
Reporting in Frederick, I'm Timothy Young for WDVM 25.
Members of this protest group say that this is not going to be their last demonstration as long as Sheriff Chuck Jenkins remains in office. The sheriff's office, though, has not responded for requests for comment.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to this. I'm pretty much finished, but
Michelle,
I think,
do you know if we have a question in the chat? Have any of these lawsuits been settled? I'm not sure if you.
I haven't seen where any of them have been settled. I mean, I did a cursory research and looked at some newspaper articles. I don't see anywhere where it has been settled. I even looked on the Facebook pages to see. I'm not sure. From what I understand, that many of these cases are still pending. And so I'm not sure if they have been or will be, successfully. I don't know what has happened with them at this point. I think I'd have to do a little bit more digging to find out about that. But I think that the thing that makes me happy and that makes me feel like there is hope for the ending of systemic racism, the ending of not valuing Black lives in the society, is the allies who are a part of these protests, and the allies that have always been a part of these protests. If you go back looking at the lynchings, if you go back and you're looking at the civil rights era, there have always been people of various races and ethnicities who have come to say that yes, Black lives matter. We need to end the structural racism that exists in this country, but most specifically in Frederick. And that Fredericktonians, not just Black Fredericktonians, but all well-meaning Fredericktonians have come together and addressed these different forms of injustice. So I think that's a good sign. I think there are more people. When I look at a lot of the more recent protests, I'm satisfied to see that there are people of all races and ethnicities that are a part of these movements. So I went a bit longer than I had wanted to, but I'm going to stop sharing the screen and see if anyone has questions or
We have another
comments.
question.
Sure.
We have another question in the chat asking if Frederick, Maryland has a proclamation against lynching on record. The bill opposing lynching in the United States has and continues to be stalled in the Senate. So I'm not sure if.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, and again, honestly, with any of the historic lynching, and I see Dina's still here, he's really the best person to address that. He has done much more in-depth research on the specifics of the lynching in Frederick County. I've looked into lynching more general throughout the country. And what I also find interesting, and maybe Dean can say something to this, or if he wants to, is that there were many cases of what appear to be near lynchings throughout the Nader period, going up until the civil rights era. So if you look at some of the newspaper accounts, you see that Black people had been chased through the streets of Frederick, but they got away. And you can only kind of guess that the outcome could have been a lynching. It could have ended tragically in that way. There were at least 2 cases of Dr. Bourne, the doctor who opened the first practice that treated African Americans and the first hospital for African Americans in Frederick. The Dr. Bourne was chased and had to hide in people's houses because there were a mob of white people chasing him through the streets of Frederick. And so I saw a lot of accounts of those types of things that could have led to that. Ever since, really, I think the first real efforts were the NAACP that tried to push forth, starting in the 19-teens, to push forth some type of lynching legislation. It's, I don't know, it sort of puzzles me, the lack of any type of definitive lynching legislation. And there's a couple things I want to say, but I'm not sure. But a lot of people, if you look at the basic definition of lynching still occurs today. Lynching still occurs today. It's not something that's over. If you say that it's a mob killing without due process, then some of the killings of African American men, even by police, could be classified as a lynching. Because you have a group of people who have killed someone they suspect is guilty of something, but that person is not the benefit of going to trial, the benefit of getting a jury of their peers to determine whether they were guilty of whatever it was that they were accused of doing. So legislation is really kind of a difficult thing to kind of navigate and see if there's anything definitive that has actually been put on the books. So would you allow Dean to say anything? Can you unmute
I think
him?
he should be able to unmute himself, I think.
Did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think to begin with, the acts that take place during lynching are illegal to begin with. It's murder.
Right.
So there obviously are laws already. And I don't know of any specific laws or other things that were passed in Frederick just to express, that lynching needs to stop. But I did want to stress that each of the cases of lynching, there was a coroner's jury that was held to determine the cause of death and the reason for the death. And in all 3 cases, although there was evidence aplenty as to who did the lynching, in all 3 cases, these juries of 12 Frederick citizens, and usually they were prominent Frederick citizens, white Frederick citizens, came back with, as you stated, that nothing was known about them, which is just outrageous because people clearly know who did these. Right. And that is a legacy that is just ridiculous that happened. So
thank you.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat. This is in reference to Baker's Park. When Baker's Park was segregated, were Black workers and domestic workers allowed in the park?
I think that's Protein. Hi, Protein. I didn't know you were here. I believe yes. And that's usually the case. Even when things were segregated, African-American, like if restaurants were segregated, very often there were African-American cooks who were in the kitchen. They'd come into the back entrance. They couldn't be seen by the general public that were out front. They couldn't be, known to even be present to a certain extent. But they were in the restaurant, just not allowed to be there as patrons. The same thing when you have buildings like the Tivoli, which is now the Weinberg. There are instances where you had African Americans who were cleaning the building. And so it appears that there were African Americans who were working there, whether it be landscaping or mowing the lawn and some of those other things. They just were not allowed to enjoy the park in a social in a social way. So
And-
the park was desegregated. I can see, I was looking at the chat, but I'll let you, you know what? I'll let you do your job. In the 1960s, the park was desegregated, and it was, again, because of a lot of pushback from Frederick residents that, you know, this is not fair. Mullinex Park, which is still there, and I mean, I grew up going to Mullinex Park myself, but you know, if you've been to Mullinex Park, it's not that wide sweeping, you know, it's got a lot of rocks, it's hilly, you know, it's sort of that land that was put aside to create Mullinex Park, you know, by Baker, because he didn't want African Americans in Baker Park. Did serve its purpose, and it has a significance in history. It was named after his chauffeur, I believe, at that time. So this was in the midst of the 60s. I do not know the exact date that occurred. I probably have it in my narrative, but I would have to go back and look at the exact date, because the narrative covers such a wide thing there. And so I'm looking also, is that Eliezer Valentin Costin, the only one that was settled, as far as I know, as far as the lawsuits against the sheriff, was the one on profiling an immigrant woman who was arrested while taking time for lunch. Yeah, there were quite a few of the growing Latinx community in Frederick, a lot of the profiling against those individuals, that there were quite a few lawsuits against that. And Frederick also has a really active Brown Lives Matter movement in the city and in the county as well, because of the growing population of Latinx citizens in the city also. So thank you for letting us know that was the only one. Yeah, I didn't even see that one when I was doing my reading about that one being settled. I didn't see any others that were settled that I'm aware of. So let's see, laboring sons. Yes, it's funny. I talked at length. I talked about laboring sons in my talk a couple of weeks ago, when I was talking specifically about the Nader and the need for separate churches, separate cemeteries, et cetera, et cetera. And I showed a brief clip about that when it was discovered. I mean, I'm sure people knew it was discovered that the Laboring Sons Cemetery was taken over with complete and utter disrespect. And I mean, and again, you're right. Billy, I can use your first name, that this was the movement that was started once it was discovered that Laboring Son Cemetery was sort of paved over. The movement that ensued by a number of African Americans in the city of Frederick was a Black Lives Matter movement. It was saying the lives of these people who are in this cemetery that you have disrespected, that you have pushed to the side, that you have no regard for, their lives matter, as well as the lives of the descendants or the family members of the people who are buried there. And we deserve a right to have those lives to be respected, that those lives do matter. So yes, there's so many examples that I could give about sort of the ongoing nature of how Frederick citizens have asserted that Black lives do matter, and just sadly couldn't put everything into my presentation, and we'd be here for hours and hours and hours. So let me see. Were there any other questions that I missed, Cavante?
No, ma'am. We just have one just post.
Yes, the hospital. There's so many examples, and the healthcare. And again, I someone else earlier.
I just have a question.
Sure.
I don't know if it got seen or not, but I had a question about the clause for the voting for Black men. I was wondering if that was similar in any way to freedmen's or freed person status at the time.
Oh, look at the baby. Hi. The movement that I was talking about with regards to the suffrage and the franchise and the suffrage group that was started, it was in 1913, so it would have been after emancipation. It would have been several decades after that. Now, there were earlier movements, obviously during the period of enslavement, where there was kind of a back and forth. That was really about location, where in some locations in the country, free and nominally free. When we say free, we can't say it's just, they were free. They were kind of free in quotation marks. People who were fighting for their right to vote at that time. And there were Black men who were granted the right to vote quite early on, even during the period of enslavement. Now, in Frederick, the real push for the franchise in Frederick really doesn't begin until the passage of the 15th Amendment. So really in the 1869, 1870, 1871 time period, you see a plethora of records and back and forth arguing over the ability of Black men having the right to vote. I mean, obviously that was the last of the 3 Reconstruction Amendments. So it was the most argued, it was the most difficult one to pass before abolishing enslavement and citizenship, the 13th and 14th Amendment. The 15th was last because there was so much back and forth. And there was, strangely enough, a lot of pushback from white women. White women did not believe, because if you understand how the abolitionist movement it was very parallel, and it went hand in hand with the women's rights movement. Many of the same white women who were part of the women's rights movement from Seneca Falls and even before that were also part of the abolitionist movement and wanted to abolish that. Even Frederick Douglass was very active in the women's rights movement. So you had a lot of people going back and forth. But at the time when Black men were granted the right to vote, white women were like, wait, we didn't want them to be enslaved, but giving Black men the vote is ridiculous. So, you see some of this racism that comes out of these same people who are fighting to abolish. And I always tell my students, just because you wanted to abolish enslavement did not mean you were warm and fuzzy with Black people, or you wanted them to be equal, or you wanted them to have the same rights. It's just that you didn't believe that they should be enslaved. So there was a lot of pushback. Granting the franchise at any period of time has always been a difficult thing. I mean, at the time that even the Constitution was ratified, the vast majority of people in this country, even white men, could not vote because of certain property rights and other things that were there. So, even when Jefferson is talking about universal suffrage, he's only talking about white men. And so that push early on to get true universal suffrage was this coalition of African-American white middle-class white women and other groups of people who are coming together to both abolish slavery and to get the vote for white women. So when Black men got the vote before white women, there was a serious pushback. A lot of white women were not happy about that situation and let it be known. So this has always been, and really, if you look at what's going on in the news today, it still is a concern. There are still efforts that are trying to, in my opinion, and again, this is my opinion, that are trying to take away voting rights of a lot of people. And I think a lot of those people tend to be African Americans, but also any of the marginalized people in society have always been denied the right to vote. So we're still trying to reach for universal suffrage. It's still not a goal that we've actually met at this point. So
I had just been wondering, so that really helped, because I had just been wondering, like, similar to Black people being able to prove that they were free, If it was similar in the voting booth with people saying like, oh, I'm the descendant of so-and-so who has, you know, access to the voting booth based off of XYZ papers.
Yeah, you have pockets of places, the places where Black men were really voting during the period of enslavement were in larger urban areas. For various and sundry reasons, but usually in the larger urban areas, you had larger populations of free Black people. Specifically, if you look at a place like Baltimore, Baltimore, very unique. It had, well, Maryland had the largest percentage or largest number of free Black people during enslavement than any other slave state in the Union. And so Frederick has always sort of lived in this in between of side by side enslaved people, Black people. They oftentimes lived in the same house. They were oftentimes married to each other. Frederick Douglass was married to a free Black woman when he was enslaved. Harriet Tubman was married to a free Black man when she was enslaved here in Maryland. So you had that, and you have that in Frederick, but it's especially the case in Baltimore. And so you have this large free Black population in Baltimore, and there are records of Black men voting in Baltimore. Obviously not huge numbers, because it was such a difficult proposition to even prove that you were eligible to vote before the end of enslavement. So it still is one of the most contested things, one of the most contested aspects of granting a voice or agency to a group of people as a whole. But thank you for that question. That's a good question. Thank you for that. And thank you for the thank you. I appreciate that. So any other questions? I kept you longer than I really intended to, but
I asked in the chat if you would be willing to share your slides because we couldn't see most of the fine print. And I know that would be very gracious if you were to do it, and I can understand why you might not want to, but
no, I sure will. I will. It's a link, so you have to go online. I will make sure it is shareable, and I will send the link to Rose. Can I send it to you or to?
Yeah, if you send it to Rose, Rose will share the link and the recording from tonight's session.
Okay, so I'm going to send it to Rose Cheney, and then she can share it with everybody who attended. I have no problem sharing that. I think I like to share as much as possible. I'm not like, I'm not coveting and holding on to any kind of information. Plus, I like the critique. I if someone can come back and say, well, maybe it's more like this. I'm always trying to improve everything. So, but no, I will send that to Rose right after I'm done here, and then she can share everything with everyone. So thank you for all of the thank yous. I'm thanking you for all of that. And I want to thank Arch for inviting me, I guess, because Rose said so. I'll be doing this again because Rose said so. So I will, I hope to be seeing some of you in future forums such as this. Or if anyone has, and thank you for again, you guys are so sweet, so nice. If anybody has any suggestions about some of the things that you would like to hear about, my narrative about Frederick history really starts in the 1600s and with the indigenous populations and comes all the way up to the present. So there's a lot in there that I can kind of play around with. If anybody is interested in any particular period, era, or topic, subject matter, I'd be happy to explore that. If you want to share that with Rose or with me, then that's awesome. But thank you all for coming. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your evening. I will let Cavante close out.
Michelle's already closed out. Michelle, thank you. We appreciate you. We look forward to the continued partnership and working together to educate those in our community. To everyone who attended tonight, we appreciate you for spending your evening with us to discuss Frederick-Black history. Please stay engaged with us. Visit our website, artsociety.org, to get more information on the society. Miss Rose will be sending out emails to let you know what's going on and when the next events will be taking place. But we, as a society, want to continue to educate those in our community on the importance of the Black history in Frederick County. So again, thank you all for all you do, for staying engaged, for being involved, and we look forward to working together with all of you. So with that, you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.